Howdy, gang, and welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host here at the Gaming Gang channel. Thanks for joining me once again. Before I dive into today's review, I do want to remind you if you enjoy the Gaming Gang and would like to support the outlet, you can do so in a couple of ways. First, you can make a one-time donation by way of PayPal, or you can become a monthly member of our Patreon. You'll find links to those down in the show notes. And of course, be sure to hang with the gang over on Discord. You'll also find an invite link to our Discord server down in those show notes. Moving right along, today I am going to be sharing my review of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Dwarf Player's Guide from Cubicle 7 Games. This 144-page hardcover with PDF carries an MSRP of $39.99. Of course, if you want to grab that free PDF, be sure to order from Cubicle 7 Games. If you want to just score the PDF alone, you can do so over at DriveThruRPG for $19.99. Having said all that, let's swing on over to the other camera because here I've got the Dwarf Player's Guide for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. A couple of things to mention before we get stuck in. First of all, my friends over at Cubicle 7 Games were kind enough to provide me with this review copy, but neither I nor anyone else affiliated with the Gaming Gang has received any other sort of compensation for me to share this review with you. It's important you know that. We're also not going to look at each and every page of the book, but I do want to give you a really good feel for what you're going to find inside. First thing we're going to do is take a peek at the credits page. A lot of folks work very hard to bring this to life, so let's give credit where credit is due. Obviously enough, by the title of this book, you already know that this is a volume which is dedicated to the dwarfs in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So, of course, not only do we have information aimed at the players, we also have tons and tons of information that's going to be very, very useful to the game masters out there also. So we're going to start off with a bit of history of the dwarfs, not only recent history, but ancient history also. We'll get information about how do the dwarfs interact with non-dwarfs, like humans and elves. What is it like to adventure in the dwarf realms? So we get information about that, as well as a breakdown, not a ton of information, but we'll get information as well about one of the major dwarf strongholds in the mountains, and it's called Karaz Angkor. I got to say, I found this to be really, really interesting info because, for one, we've got three factions of dwarfs, essentially. We have the dwarfs that still remain within the realms. We also have the dwarfs that wander throughout the empire. They're referred to as imperial dwarfs. So many adventuring characters will be known as imperial dwarfs. We also have Norse dwarfs up north. Then we get a relatively lengthy section about role-playing as a dwarf character. So the dwarfs are similar in some respects in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as they are in other role-playing games, but there are some things that make them quite a bit different and make them stand out. Now, of course, they are fabulous builders and engineers. They're a bit cantankerous, but one aspect of the dwarfs in WFRP I really like is just how honor-bound they are, how that plays into a lot of the interactions that they will have with non-dwarfs. So grudges are a big deal. There are books of grudges, not only for the dwarf kingdom, but also individual dwarfs. We've got a section a little further on in the book, which is going to detail that also. Got a lot of various different tables available to us if you want to randomly create your origin for your dwarf player character. I always like that with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay because if you just leave things up to fate, you get more experience points to spend to make your character a little more powerful right at the beginning. So we have 10 new dwarf careers, as well as some changes, some additional options for the dwarf careers that you'll find in the core rule book. And there's a really nice variety of new dwarf careers here. They're not all just warriors. We've got sages, we've got rangers, we've got 3 different priests, such as the Doom Priest. Most dwarfs do not celebrate war, accepting it as a grim necessity to keep their people safe. Yet they immortalize the heroics of their warrior ancestors who found glorious deaths in combat. These warrior cults are kept alive by the Doom Priests, bombastic warmongers rarely found far from the front line. Their stories are an inspiration to dwarfs seeking to emulate their ancestors' valorous deeds, slayers most especially. We get some new options for dwarf slayer characters, keeping in mind that a dwarf slayer isn't a standard career. So we get into more detail about that. And of course, dwarf slayers are something that's well established, not only in the role playing games, but in Warhammer Fantasy miniatures games also. We've got the rune smith, because something that's introduced in the Dwarf Player's Guide is rune smithing, which is adding special abilities to weapons and armor. Here's that section I had mentioned about grudges, recording grudges, how grudges start, resolving grudges. We have a section about equipment, so we'll have new weapons. We also get information about the various different black powder weapons that dwarfs create. So we'll get the hand cannons as well as regular cannons. We get different vehicles. The dwarfs are famous for their gyrocopters. So we get a lot of detail about skycraft. They also are very famous for their naval vessels. So we get watercraft. And there's a lot of page space devoted to new gear, new equipment, new weapons, the vehicles, and so forth. We get some famous weapons as well, such as Galmaraz, which is wielded by the Emperor, not the Dwarf Emperor, but the Imperial Emperor. There's more detail about that if you're familiar with the Enemy Within campaign, which is fantastic. The 5 volumes that were released as a director's cut, as well as your companions, are excellent. If you've not checked out my reviews of those, by all means, please do. Then we'll get into our rune smithing, discussing how to go about rune smithing, all of these various different runes, which are going to add special abilities to different pieces of gear. As I mentioned, weapons, armor, and such. You'll have the limit of 3 runes per piece, and no runesmith has ever been able to put a 4th rune on an item. I guess maybe that could be an adventure hook of some sort. We're going to wrap up with the dwarf cults and a trio of entities that are renowned and revered by the dwarfs. And then we also have some information about how the dwarfs venerate their ancestors too. So as you can see, this book is packed with content. Granted, we've got, the history and things like that, but this isn't a book that's just overflowing with fluff either. There's tons of content here that can be utilized by both the players and game masters in a WFRP campaign. So that's a peek inside Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Dwarf Player's Guide from Cubicle 7 Games. Once again, the hardcover with PDF carries an MSRP of $39.99, or you can grab just the PDF alone over at DriveThruRPG for $19.99. Let's swing back over to the other camera so I can share some final thoughts as well as my review score. I've got to say, I enjoyed the hell out of reading the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Dwarf Player's Guide. It is crammed full of useful information, gameable information. This is certainly not a fluff book by any stretch of the imagination. Gotta say, learned a lot about the dwarfs that I was not aware of as far as the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay universe. Now, if you've seen past reviews of WFRP products that I have shot, you know I really enjoy Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Love the setting, love the attitude of the setting also, but I'm not necessarily the most well versed in Warhammer Fantasy lore, especially that which is handed down from the miniatures games. But still, I was super impressed by the amount of content that is packed within and how much I learned about WFRP dwarfs. Now, as far as the production quality, paper stock, very, very solid. Artwork throughout, excellent. It's got a stitched binding. This is going to hold up to repeated use at your game table. Now, I will say I did not intensely study the new careers and gear and options and things like that. So it is possible that there could be an error here or there. There were a handful of typos, but nothing that was jarring that really stood out either. Now, of course, if you are a game master or player and you feel, hey, the core book information about the dwarfs is fine, you're not going to score this as highly as I will. But if you're a player who wants to play as a dwarf, or if you are a game master who really wants to bring dwarfs to life in your WFRP campaigns, this is an absolute must buy. So, on a scale of 0 to 10, I give the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Dwarf Player's Guide a 9.5 out of 10. It is excellent. All right, that is it for this time out. If you like the video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already. And if you do subscribe, don't forget, ring that bell. It'll not only let you know when I share videos such as this review, it'll also inform you when my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings right here on YouTube. And of course, when you're not watching videos on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to visit gaminggang.com for all latest in tabletop gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more you will not find on YouTube. You know the drill. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Once again, I'm Jeff McAleer. Thank you very much for watching. And until I see you next time, I certainly hope all of you get to enjoy plenty of great gaming with your gang.